Welcome back, guys. You know what time it is. It is data mine time. New update to Azur Lane coming today. It is the first UR event of 2024, and it's going to be called Snowrealm Peregrination. And guys, she is finally here. This event finally brings us Sovetsky Soyuz. She stopped trolling us, and she now will be in-game as of today. It only took years for her to finally come from the first time that she was revealed, and man, has her look evolved over those years. So before we get into this new event, let's talk about last week's minor update that brought us very few changes. Ninghai and Pinghai, along with their new skins, got new augment modules. As we've grown accustomed to over the years, Chinese upgrades during Chinese Lunar New Year are pretty good, and these augment modules are similar. They are strong. They allow a lot more DPS coming out of these two ships when paired together. They allow you to shift the positioning in the fleet to gain more of an offensive style versus a defensive style, and of course they boost stats. So these are good if you are going to run either of these ships. You should definitely get their augment module. Additionally, there's going to be a mini event called Mist Upon Silver Summits that came out last week. You should be finishing it right about now, and it will reward you with a new item. This item is called Cross Brooch, and it is not very good. It does allow Vichy France ships to get an additional barrage when they're in the flagship, but you're going to be putting on a Vanguard to get that barrage. The HP is just lower than usual. The barrage isn't particularly great, so this is not going to be something that sees a lot of play, but it's virtually free to pick up, so why not? That is all of the updates from last week, so let's get into the updates from this week. Before we get into the big event, let's talk about challenge modes. Obviously, it is the end of the month, and March 1st, we are going to be switching over to Pisces. And that reminds me that I haven't finished this month's challenge mode, so I need to finish that today, otherwise I lose out. So I guess I'll be doing that during my stream tonight. Alright, so Pisces is going to be a pair of Duke of York and King George V. They are both heavy armor. There's a good chunk of heals here, and it looks like the barrages target the enemy farthest away, so watch out on your backline. Should be fun. Alright, with that out of the way, let's move on to the main event. Of course, this event will bring us a new dorm set, as well as new gear skins and new ship skins. Monarch and Alan M. Sumner get cool skins, as well as all the new ships get a new skin with them, and an L2D comes for Soyuz. As far as lore goes, we got a few things that dropped. Silver Fox returns to the story, and the 5th human in the game gets added. She goes by, roughly translated, Clay. Shop-wise, we are going to get Pamiat Meta in the shop. This is going to be similar to how we had U556 meta in the shop and in the gacha. So she's going to be the second meta ship that's not going to be from cruise missions or Operation Siren. Additionally, Soyuz's gun will be in the shop, so that should be pretty easy to obtain as well. And if the standard set of things that you have in a shop will also be available there too. I was actually pretty pleasantly surprised to find that outside of Pamiat Meta, which actually is a copy of a ship that was real, all of the new ships are real ships in a way. Not all of them were completed and, floated, but they did get started. They were actual projects, and so that's exciting to get back to an event with a lot of history, so I'm happy about that. While that might be exciting, the fleet tech isn't that exciting. There's a lot of just HP buffs, so it's like, alright, fleet tech kind of sucks, but it is what it is. So let's get into the actual ships. So starting off, we have Sovetsky Soyuz. She is the second UR for the Russian faction. The Soviets were the first minor faction to get a UR, and now they have their second one before any other minor faction has a UR. A little bit of favoritism, maybe? Stat-wise, Soyuz is amazing. She has over 10,000 health. Currently, there are only 2 other ships in the game that have broken the 10,000 HP marker. That is Musashi and FDG. Speaking of FDG, Sovetsky Soyuz looks very similar to FDG stat-wise. She actually is buffed a little bit. She has the exact same firepower, but she has more anti-air, more reload, more HP, and more luck. She does lose out on hit stat and main gun efficiencies, but to be stat-wise as one of the best battleships in the game, the DR FDG, Soyuz is starting off with a good base. We'll see what her skills add to her, and if she is going to basically be a power crept version of FDG or not. Skill number 1, when her main gun finishes loading, not when it fires, when it loads, 100% chance to trigger a special barrage that grants the enemies that are hit with the barrage a debuff for 6 seconds. This barrage has a bunch of damage. It comes with a bunch of bombs and the coefficients are good. They have priority aim as well, and it has splash damage. It looks amazing with a lot of ice aesthetic around it, and actually if you look at the barrage field of what it hits, it's going to hit a lot of enemies. So these debuffs will be applied to a lot of things that this barrage will be able to hit. First thing is, the speed is reduced by 40%, so it's going to freeze them, which is great because this is right before you've finished reloading, so you're going to fire that salvo into something that's been slowed. Plus 8% damage taken. Great. This is right before she's going to fire her salvo, so you're going to get extra damage basically on her salvo because the barrage will hit most things. Also, it's 8% damage taken by anyone, so if you have Soyuz lined up with all of your other battleships in a battleship fleet, they all get the damage buff. Great. Soyuz also gets a plus 10% crit rate against this enemy, so this is specific to her, but she's going to be able to crit more chances here. This looks great. This barrage looks fantastic. It's got things that are doing stuff, and it's good. Maybe not necessarily as good as something like a Musashi barrage or a New Jersey barrage. I'd probably also say it's a little worse than Vanguard's buff. It's probably on par where Bismarck II's skill is with her suction black hole thing that, you know, has all the enemies go to a single point and makes it easier for her to land hits. This one does a similar thing with the speed reduction, and it gives, you know, some damage increase. So probably similar to Bismarck II with this skill. I like it though, and it's pretty good. All right, skill number 2. All Soviet Navy ships get plus 15% firepower, torpedo stat, and aviation. Those are all the damage dealing stats. Great, the Russians needed a faction buffer. It's simple, it's good, and as we expected, she is going to be a requirement for any Soviet Navy fleet you're ever going to run. Continuing on, when there are 2 or more carriers or light carriers in the fleet, the main fleet, all of them, including herself, gets plus 10% hit stat and plus 10% damage for the carriers. So she doesn't get the carrier damage buff, but she gets the hit stat buff if you have 2 carriers. And this is actually not locked to anything in the Soviet Navy, which is very interesting. So you could put her in totally like 2 other carriers and she can buff them. They don't have to be Russian, which is really cool. This makes her have a lot of utility. Of course, you prefer them to be Russian because then you can get the buff from the first part of this skill, the 15% aviation stat, but they don't have to be. And Chkalov and Volga, I think, are some of the best Russian carriers, but they are much worse than their alternatives that are non-Russian. You, of course, can use them, and Soyuz is going to help them become better, specifically like Volga if you're going to be running that type of fleet. But having the option to just buff all carriers seems really strong and could be usable in this situation. Additionally, when there are 2 or more battleships, she includes herself in there, and this also includes aviation battleships, Soyuz herself, the only ship, gets plus 10% crit rate, plus 10% reload, and plus 10% damage. So in that case, you're probably going to be doing that more often. You probably are going to have her and another battleship more likely than 2 other carriers. So this is more likely. I think it's a little bit worse because it's directly only buffing her, but it's 10% damage and 10% reload. So she's going to be firing faster. She's going to be dealing extra damage. That extra reload, she's going to actually be beneficial in having her not just fire with all of your other battleships. So that's actually a really good benefit there so that you don't have to run into the universal cooldowns. I really like this skill all around. She has the buff for the faction. She has the buff for like universal carriers, or she has the buff for herself that allows her to run in a triple battleship fleet without getting punished by universal cooldowns. And you can still run like the best guns. You can run 3 of the best guns instead of having to deal with all the timing issues. So really like this skill as well. 2 for 2 so far. Just got a 3rd one. Skill number 3. Enemy torpedoes get minus 10% damage and minus 20% crit rate when hitting Soyuz. Ooh, this got close. This is very good. Obviously, torpedoes in PvP are oppressive, so being able to deal with, you know, Shimikaze or Jinsu meta are pretty nice here. It only is for herself though, which is interesting. So it's not as good as Vittorio Veneto. Vittorio Veneto gives a flat 20%. She gets 10% and a crit rate reduction, and only for herself. The crit rate is actually really nice because a lot of times, you know, a 10k ship is not going to get killed without it getting critical hit by like a Shimikaze or something. So, you know, decreasing that chance is, I think, really helpful here. This is nice. This is certainly not as good as becoming invincible or, you know, straight up evasion, but it is super nice. It can help her survive from people who are using like T-Torp strategies in PvP. In PvE, torpedoes typically aren't going to be killing your backline. It's not really a risk. So this is kind of more aimed at PvP than any other things in the game so far. Additionally, if there are any other Soviet Navy ships in the fleet, Soviet Navy ships take 15% less burn damage. If that just said less damage, that would be absolutely ludicrous, and it would be insane because we'd all be trying to figure out what Russian ship are we going to pair with her, like what is going to happen. But it's just burn damage, so this is actually one of those things you could probably forego. Burn damage isn't a super big thing. I mean, it is in like World 9, 10, whatever, but if you're fighting with like all URs in World 9, 10, you'll be fine. You don't really care about the burn too much. There are plenty of heals in the game at this point where you can heal at rates that are similar to what burn damage will be dealing. Burn damage is not a big factor in PvP, so like, I mean, interesting. I guess it kind of plays with the ice mechanic, but I don't particularly think that part's great or something that you should limit to your construction of fleets around. I mean, sure, she does buff Soviet Navy ships, so if you want to throw them in there, great, but this is not something you need. And then finally, she gets a cross-fleet barrage. This is pretty basic. It happens every 18 seconds in the cross-fleet. It's just another one. It is what it is. It's just like another barrage. Fine. Like every UR that comes in gotchas apparently is going to get these, so that's just the way it is. So overall, though, this ship looks pretty busted. It's probably on the level of Bismarck II, I would say, in terms of power. She's got more health, and damage wise seems pretty similar. She's got that freeze in the barrage, similar to the kind of the black hole in a way, kind of doing the crowd control mechanics. She buffs her faction just like Bismarck. Like, she seems very much like a Bismarck II, and that's very strong. I'm interested to see how she does in PvP, because she doesn't strike immediately, is jumping into the meta, which typically has 2 battleships and Kearsarge right now, and it could be interesting that maybe people could sub out one of those options for her, but I think she's probably going to be more like Bismarck II, where she probably isn't going to be there, but I could stand corrected here. She's like very much on the fence, but I like her. I think that's fantastic for a minor faction flagship that she's going to be. She doesn't actually have to be in the flagship. It's more of a carryover from the fact that faction buffers used to have to be in the flagships. Now they don't. She's very powerful, and you could throw her in plenty of fleets that have no Russians at all, and she'd be totally fine. Very powerful ship. Definitely pick her up. All right, moving on to the next ship, we have the SR destroyer Ognevoy. Anyway. Stat-wise, she's a destroyer. She doesn't have a lot of things going for her. She has more firepower than I would expect. Her torpedoes are very bad for a destroyer. She doesn't have a main gun +1 though, so that puts her behind basically all of the other decent firepower-based destroyers that we're talking about in the meta. She's got good gun efficiencies though, but stat-wise, nothing's very special. So she's going to need something from her skills that make up for that. Her skill number 1 says that she gets +15% firepower, so like, okay, but as a destroyer, she's got not a ton, so like it's effectively like 20 some extra firepower. Great. Okay. When this ship is afloat, every 10 seconds you heal 1% to the whole Vanguard fleet, so she's a healer. That's actually pretty useful, and it has no restrictions. You can put her in anything and she'll heal the whole fleet every 10 seconds. So 60 seconds in, you get 6% health. That's pretty decent. Heals have really come a long way in the last probably year and a half. Before that, they were like hard to come by, and you were like really struggling to get the heals. Now it feels like heals are a lot of things that they're adding in recent ships. So, if this came out 2 years ago, I'd been like, oh my gosh, it's a heal and it's great, it's unconditional. We've seen a lot of these type of heals come out more recently, but it's still a good heal for, mind you. Definitely a good heal, so don't sleep on that, especially if you want to pair her with Soyuz. Also, the first time this triggers, so that's 10 seconds into the battle, she gets +12% self damage that she deals. Great damage increase across the board, doesn't matter what type, doesn't matter who it's against, it's just damage increase. That's fantastic. Weird you gotta wait 10 seconds for it, but sure, you gotta wait the first 10 seconds. She's weaker, and then after that she'll get strong, and 12% is nothing to scoff at, even for a destroyer. Good. I believe it also goes for the whole battle. So after 10 seconds for the rest of the battle, she gets the buff, which is fine. So first skill is actually pretty good and not too bad. Skill number 2, if there are other Soviet Navy ships afloat in the fleet, that's fine. You would never run the ship without running her with Soyuz. Ever. Like, there's no reason to ever run this ship without Soyuz, I don't think. So that's fine. She's all gonna have that. She's gonna get an additional full firepower skill, which is every 20 seconds she is able to have a 60% chance to increase her firepower by 40% for 10 seconds. All right, 40% something, but it is only every 20 seconds for 10 seconds with a 60% chance. So it's like, it's not something you can super rely on, but it's there and it can trigger. And it's kind of interesting. They're like, all right, it gets a full firepower, but it's not like it only happens with another Soviet Navy This skill also has an additional trigger that has every 10 seconds, there's a 70% chance to trigger a barrage. And if it sinks the enemy with this barrage, she gets to fire it again, and she max procs 2 every 5 seconds. That's actually a lot. And in something like PvP, it doesn't matter, but she's a healing ship, so we're never going to talk about that. But in a mob fleet, this becomes kind of busted in a way, because if you're fighting against like suicide boats, or if you're fighting against like really weak enemies where you're a little bit overpowered because of the level difference, she can start killing things off this barrage really quickly, and then it triggers again and again, and it keeps triggering every time you kill stuff. Obviously there's a cap on it because it seems kind of busted, but that's interesting. And then she has an all-out assault that also increases her firepower by 20% for 5 seconds, or for 10 seconds, but it happens at a 50% chance. And of course, her limit break 3 is that she halves the requirement to trigger her all-out assault. So if it's base 10 fires, she only has to do it every 5 fires, and then she gets a 50% chance to increase the firepower. So she's got a lot of firepower buffs. She gets a base buff, she gets another chance every 20 seconds to buff it, and then she gets another chance every 5 shots to basically buff it again at a 50% chance. So there's a lot of chances to buff that firepower, and that seems like kind of where they're going with this, is they're like buffing firepower. Overall though, I don't know. She deserves a spot in a mob fleet that wants to be Russian. Like a Russian mob fleet, she deserves a spot because she's a good healer. And you could run like Soyuz, Volga, and Ognevoy, and I don't know how to say her name. I'm going to butcher all these names. But this destroyer plus Soyuz plus Volga makes a pretty strong Russian fleet for mobbing. So I do like it. She's not bad. She's not something that's like amazing or revolutionary, but that's kind of going to be the way that SRs in destroyers, I feel like, are these days. All right, we're going to move on to the elites because they're real ships, and we'll talk about Pamiat last because it's a meta ship. All right, moving on, we got the elite battleship Poltava. She is a sister of Ganga, which heavily influences the way that her stats run, and that's fine. They're not good. It's an elite battleship. That's pairing with, yeah, it's just not good. It's an old battleship too. It needs work. But let's see if we have any fun skills. Gangut herself had fun skills. So she gets a 15% firepower boost. Great. She's going to need it. Her base firepower is like 328, which is like what, 130 less than Soyuz. Like, gonna need some help. When the ship's main gun hits an enemy, there's a 70% chance to slow that enemy by 15% for 8 seconds. And that enemy takes 12% more damage from Gangut class battleships and Soviet Navy Vanguard ships. All right, well, I see the Gangut class, so she can be paired with her sister, but she has to, first of all, hit the enemy. So it has to target the right thing. It has to land. It has to not miss. And then there's a 70% chance. And if all of that happens, you get a 12% more damage from just Gangut class battleships. So it doesn't even apply to Soyuz. Like, she doesn't even buff Soyuz. Obviously, it's meant to make you want to use her sister, but man, it's bad. I mean, and the slow is 15%. Like, you'll barely notice that. I mean, it will be like, it's a thing, but like, you'll barely notice that as a player. I do not like that barrage at all. Also, when this ship is afloat, all Soviet Navy ships gain plus 10% evasion. That's cool. Minus 15% burn damage to all Soviet Navy ships except Poltava. Oh, okay. So she doesn't even buff herself. They're like, all Soviet Navy ship buffs except you. I think this ship could have totally buffed herself, and it would have been still very fair, still not a very good ship. So the fact that they just like went out of their way to exclude herself from her own buff, the buff wasn't even that good. It's not evasion rate and it's not damage, it's burn damage and evasion stat. So it's like, okay, they're decent. She is a buffer, a faction buffer, which is more than I can say I expected for her. She's like a weaker Soyuz in every single way possible. Also, when she takes damage, she triggers a special barrage, and all Soviet Navy ships take 10% less damage for 10 seconds. Okay, well, that's good. That part's actually good. There's a 20-second cooldown on that, but a 10% damage reduction for 10 seconds across the board, that's actually pretty good. I was giving her crap, and she's still not that good, but that's actually very useful. Like, that could be pretty useful if you're running a 6 Russian fleet. Like 6 Russian ships in a fleet, you potentially could run her. I still like, the first skill is just such a bad barrage. I just don't understand it. But the second one it's all right. The second skill is decent. I'll give her that. Collection only, in my opinion, though, for people who are really into the Russian faction. All right, we're going to the next elite destroyer. She's going to be attainable through the accumulation rewards, so not in the gacha. She is, as Hawk would call her, girl with the gun to her head. Svirepy, or however. Stat-wise, she's literally Ognevoy, but worse. So, you know, not starting off great, but she's an elite destroyer. I guess I like her DD gun efficiency, but she does seem just like a weaker stat version of the SR destroyer in this event. So let's see if the skills have anything fun. Every 18 seconds, she has a 60% chance to fire a special barrage. Enemies hit by the barrage lose 15% accuracy stat for 8 seconds, and they take 10% more damage from this ship, and this ship only. So that's terrible. I mean, it's 18 seconds is slow, 60% chance is pretty low for a barrage these days, and the damage buff that comes from it only is from her, and her stats are terrible, so she's not dealing a lot of damage to begin with. So yeah, bad skill. Okay, skill number 2. When the ship fires her main gun 15 times, she slows down by 3 speed, so for 5 seconds, so she slows down. That's usually a bad thing in most cases. You're not trying to slow down ever, really. It's usually bad, almost always. After that effect ends, the ship takes 10% less damage for the rest of the battle. So she fires her gun 15 times. She loses speed for a little bit, and then afterwards she gets like a damage reduction buff. Great. It's like fine. I also missed the fact that she gets plus 15% anti-air stat at the top. Is hiding up there. All right, that's like one of the worst stats anyway, and then she gets an all-out assault. So this ship is definitely collection only. It's pretty garbage. This is a pretty bad ship. I mean, this would have been bad 4 years ago still when we were talking about Soyuz. So yeah, this is not a good ship. All right, let's move on to Pamiat Merkuria over here. So she obviously gets another copy. This doesn't surprise me. Stat-wise, she's very similar to her base copy. And she gets her main gun +1, so that's very nice, which, you know, Pamiat got with her retrofit, so she gets that base-wise, so she's similar to her retrofit version. Cool. Good to see. And then skill number 1. Every 12 times this ship fires her main gun, she triggers a level 10 barrage that scales off this skill's level, and it's going to deal more damage with the more damage that she's received. So the less HP she has, the more damage she deals, up to 20% more damage that she can deal. So the barrage is nice. It's basically like a second all-out assault that's more powerful. So she's got another all-out assault basically. I mean, meta ships tend to have a lot of barrages, so this makes sense. And then obviously more damage, you know, dealt can be useful. And with a main gun +1, that's nothing to scoff at. Also, when she takes damage, there's a 15% chance that she enters former glory state for 10 seconds, where she evades all attacks, and her firepower and torpedo stat are boosted by 20%. It has a 20-second cooldown, which is not that bad. I mean, this is literally like an Eldritch skill. I mean, it's slightly worse because it only affects her. She's the only one that becomes invincible, but effectively it is what Eldritch skill does, but just for herself. This is really good, and Pamiat Merkuria has a much better body than like Eldritch. Eldritch is a very weak ship, very bad stats, and nothing else really going for her. Her barrage is like decent 5 years ago. This ship is actually decent in a lot of other ways, so slapping one of these on her is interesting. Obviously, this would be something you use for like PvP. The thing is, PvP, this like Laffy 2 just kind of takes out the need for this type of skill in your Vanguard right now. So I won't think that this skill will be played in PvP currently, but it is something interesting to come back and take a look at and see. And given that it doesn't need to like die or anything, you can be triggering this when she's at like 90% health. It is still effective as a damage mitigation when you're playing in PvE. In fact, you'll probably be taking plenty of like, you know, small damage stray shots from mobs and stuff, and this allows her to just become invincible, which is kind of nice. Like, you can actually use her kind of as a tank because of this skill. I really do actually like this skill. For skill number 3, she gets plus 10% firepower stat and hit stat. Those are good stats for someone with the main gun +1. Every 20 seconds, all enemies within the range of 55 of her get minus 20% speed for 10 seconds. So she basically just has like an area around her that just slows everybody. 20-second mark, it really loved if that was 15 seconds instead of 20. It would have been so much more useful. At 20 seconds, and it loses a lot of its value, but it's still a slow. It is 20%, so it's a, you know, it's not 40 or 60 like I would have liked as well. Yeah, if this skill would have said 15 seconds and 60%, I would have loved this skill. Given it says 20 seconds and 20% less useful, but still not bad. Like, it's still fine. And then she also has all out assaults, so she gets the benefit in Opsai where she gets extra damage against elites and boss nodes. That's pretty standard for meta ships. She gets an all out assault that is enhanced when she gets her invincible former glower emote, so that's also interesting. So she's gonna have a lot of shells flying around. Damage wise, she looks decent. Survivability wise, she looks decent. Like, this meta ship looks good. I think she's got a lot of things going for her. I kind of think she's better than the SR destroyer. I mean, Soyuz is definitely the way to go here. This is, I mean, it's the UR, it's the target. It is what it is. But as far as meta ships go, she's one of the better Vanguard meta ships out there. Kind of up there with like Helena meta, I would say, and maybe Fortune meta and Jinsu meta. That's probably in the tier where she's at as far as that goes. So a good ship, actually, a good meta ship to actually go for. You can get her completely through the event shop, so she should be pretty free if you just play the event. All right, that's all the ships. We're not getting anything else ship-wise, but we do have 2 new equipments we want to talk about, and both of them are very good. So first up, let's talk about the B-37 406mm MK1 gun. It's a battleship gun. It is also the Soyuz gun, and this gun is good. It is AP special ammo. It's not AP plus like a 457, but it's AP special ammo similar to the champagne gun. And that's what I'm going to be comparing it to in a lot of ways. It does more damage than that because it has the same honor modifiers and it has increased damage. It goes 165 times 3 instead of 150 times 3. So that's a good chunk of extra damage coming out of this gun. It's an SR gun, so it has the same firepower loadout. It actually seems like an upgrade to the champagne gun. Keep in mind, it's a little bit slower than the champagne gun, but the champagne gun is very slow in its own right. That's one of its weaknesses, one of the reasons you don't run it. And given the difference is only like 0.4 of a second, in a situation where you're going to be running the champagne gun because you're already in a battle where the timing doesn't matter that much and you really need the boosted damage against medium or heavy armor, that is not going to matter. Like, theoretically, you could argue the DPS differences and things like that, but 0.4 of a second is not going to matter if you're already okay with waiting for 24 seconds. Waiting for 24.4 seconds is going to be just fine. You don't use the champagne gun in PvP, so this is not something you'll probably bring to PvP ever, but in certain boss maps where you want a 3-shot high damage AP shot against like a specific boss that has a timer of, you know, a minute 30 or a minute or 2 minutes or whatever, where you have timed it out where the 24 seconds is not a penalty versus like the 17 seconds that you could potentially get elsewhere, or you're using, you know, high powered fire control radars to fix some of this stuff. Anyway, the point is, if you're going to use a champagne gun, you might as well take the extra 15 damage per shell. Like, it's definitely better. So I would say this is an upgrade, and that's exciting. So we have a new good gun to look at. Next up, we have an elite auxiliary item, and usually these don't make my list as something to be talking about, but this ascension box actually very good. So its HP is the base 500, 530 if you get to plus 11, which is fine. That's typically, you know, that's the same range as a repair toolkit, so that's in the good range that we're talking about. A lot of SR auxiliary items are at that 500 range, and of course they can get higher when you get to plus 13 over plus 11, but generally it's a good place to start. But let's look about this skill here. At the start of the battle, if the flagship is a battleship or battle cruiser or aviation battleship, decrease the flagship's equipped main gun spread by 2. That's great. That is something that you're going to want to do on almost all battleships in the game. They almost all have high spreads, and you want to usually decrease those spreads. Kronstadt has one of the best cross fleets, in my opinion, because she reduces the spread of the other fleet's Vanguard, and this basically does that. You are probably going to want to put this on a lot of things in your fleet if you're running a flagship Vanguard. If you're not, you don't necessarily need it. It's not necessarily going to hurt you, though. That HP stat's pretty similar to what you're going to get most of the other times, but this is something to be wary of, especially if you're running destroyers that need extra HP and have nothing to put on them. PvP, I could see this actually being used a lot in PvP, especially since we're in like triple battleship fleet meta in a lot of ways. So the triple battleship fleet like would definitely like this. So this is I think, a must pickup. It's very unique. So I think both of these are must pickups because the one gun strictly better than, or virtually strictly better than the, best in slot for a specific type of boss. And the Ascension box is just so unique and has a lot of utility. That uniqueness is not just like unique for the sake of it. It actually has a lot of utility in decreasing spread. So both of these are must pick up items. Do not leave this event without either of these items, and obviously don't leave without Soyuz. All right, so that's everything for the event. The event didn't actually have a ton of new stuff in it, but I talked a good chunk here about the things that I wanted. I actually really did like this event. I think I was a little bit bummed that Pamiat Meta got a ship in the gacha. I don't know. I don't like meta ships coming in the gacha. That's not my thing. But they did give me 4 historical ships for the rest of the gacha, so I'm very pleased about that. Soyuz stopped blue balling us, so she's finally in the game. She looks amazing. She's a great faction buffer. I would put her basically on the same level as Bismarck II in terms of power level. She does little things differently, obviously, but she seems very similar to a Bismarck. We got 2 new equipments that are great. The Soyuz gun is a great gun, and then we got a really niche but kind of interesting elite auxiliary item. In terms of everything else, though, everything not related to Soyuz in this event is kind of like okay. I mean, the other ships, Pamiat's decent. Pamiat has some utility. I could definitely see her useful, and if we do ever get like a meta fleet faction buffer, she potentially gets used in that. But yeah, I don't know. The other Russian healer girl, the other SR destroyer was, I don't know, she's got a decent heal on her and whatnot, but it's nothing. I mean, she's gonna be one of those ships that I forget about very quickly after this event. She's like decent. If you're trying to run a full Russian fleet, she probably makes it in the cut. Although honestly, the Russian Vanguard is pretty decent. It's the main fleet where the Russian faction really struggles. I mean, they got like Paimat and Chapyev and Kronstadt, so they got plenty of things in the Vanguard, so I don't even know if she makes the cut there, but she does have some usefulness with the heal and the fact that, her barrage, when it kills something, it triggers another one, so you can like chain that in a mob fleet. This definitely makes the Russian faction a lot better, but simply because Soyuz is good. I don't think any of the other ships get used. I think Poltava doesn't. I don't think Svirepy gets used. Pamiat Meta doesn't get used in a Russian fleet ever. Maybe a meta faction fleet, but never a Russian one. And I think Soyuz is probably the only ship you're gonna probably use out of this event, which, that's fine. It's a minor faction event. I'm excited for it. So we're going to be streaming it tonight. We're going to be doing it opening night. The last time I did an opening night stream for a new event has been a long while, so I'm super excited. So please come out and we'll literally go through the event. I usually do those streams, but they usually come like the weekend afterward, or they take, I don't do them immediately, but today I'm able to do it immediately. So we are going to have one tonight. So I hope you guys can show up. I also got to make sure that I finish that challenge mode because tonight's the last night, so we'll get to struggle on that. Hopefully we get that done, and I'm really looking forward to it. We'll see. Not like the most exciting event, but Soyuz finally comes and she does not disappoint. I think that's the big takeaway from this event. Thank you guys for watching. I super appreciate it, and I will see you guys next time, and take care.